All right, welcome back, students and staff of Warrensburg-Latham. We are here again for another episode of our mental wellness video series, and today we are going to be talking about anxiety. Now, I think this is something that, especially in the past year of COVID and all that comes with that, I think this has been more of a buzzword, and people have been talking about and worrying about and thinking about anxiety more than ever before.
I think you're actually really correct. I mean, if we were having this conversation 18 months ago, this would be a very different conversation because, to be fair, all of us have gotten closer probably to what would be considered clinical anxiety than most of us have ever gotten before. But that is not all a bad thing, because I think it helps build empathy for those that really do struggle with the difference between I'm worried about stuff or I'm worried about the future and what would be considered clinical anxiety. Give me a couple different compare-contrasts between worry and anxiety.
Okay, so kind of like we talked before in the depression episode, so there's normal feelings, and worry is a normal feeling, and to a point being anxious, like I'm anxious about what I'm going to do this weekend, or I'm anxious about how this test is going to go. To a point, that can be normal. When it becomes debilitating or it's interfering with your normal functioning in your life, that's when it becomes more of a clinical concern. So when, again, your sleep is affected, your eating is affected, your grades are affected, your personal hygiene becomes affected, your relationships with other people are starting to be impacted. That's when we have more of a concern, when it's eating up a lot of your time, worrying and stressing about things that may or may not ever actually happen. That's when it becomes a problem.
Now, see, this is interesting because almost everything you mentioned there, we mentioned during our depression topic. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the same effects, a lot of the same symptoms of clinical anxiety are going to be true of clinical depression. Now, let's also define a word here, because I think we've used it a couple times, and I think we need to pause and take a minute to define. Clinical. What makes something clinical?
Okay, so when something is clinical, and me being a mental health clinician, that's why I use these terms without realizing that I'm talking to students, is that's when it becomes a significant issue, or when you went to a doctor and they would be diagnosing you. There's a difference between I've had a bad week, I'm worried about how I did on my ACTs, and I haven't slept in 3 days, I have been not eating and sleeping for 2 weeks, things like that. When it's a more prolonged situation and you actually go to a physician or a mental health professional and get diagnosed, it would be a clinical situation.
So something that requires treatment beyond the normal course of events, that's where we kind of start crossing or approaching that clinical line, rather than just I'm worried. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now here's the other piece of this puzzle is we have students, and those students have ball games, those students have tests, those students have jobs, maybe those students have friend groups, social media is out there. You got to keep up on the social media, you got to keep up on your friends. How do I notice the difference between I'm just maybe too involved, maybe I'm too wound up, and maybe I have a problem? How do I know that?
Well, and like I said, a lot of it has to do with how your functioning is impaired and the amount of time or the duration that you've been having these problems. So like we said earlier, if you're nervous about a test that's happening in a couple days, that's not clinical anxiety.
And so, for example, when that test is over, then you come down.
Then you should feel some relief, and your worries and your anxiety should decrease.
Right. Now, even if I didn't do well on that test, and maybe I worry again that test is going to affect my grade badly, that's a different worry caused by a different stimulus. That's not necessarily anxiety overall.
Right.
Just because I didn't do well on the test, there's going to be some ups and some downs on this. And the same thing, anxiety can actually be a good thing, like ahead of the game.
It can be, because it can be a motivator, and it can help kind of keep you sharp and keep you focused and on point. It's, again, when it becomes a problem for you or for people around you that are noticing it, that it becomes a situation where it would require intervention. So people that are anxious, they don't have a lot of that up and down. They feel that heightened sense of like tightness and stress and worry all the time. And they're kind of on edge all the time, waiting or watching for something to happen.
It kind of reminds me of the squirrel. If you ever watch a squirrel and he's out there and he's moving feverishly and always looking around, and if that is something that maybe you feel like all the time, without that break, without being able to, when you go home, turn on the video games and maybe do a half-hour video games, or when you go home, turn on the TV, or you open up that book, or you go for that walk and you're not able to come down.
Right.
That may be a warning sign.
I would say so. If you're trying to do things to cope and try to relax and calm yourself and you feel like that's still not working, that would be a cause for concern, and that would be when you would want to go to the trusted adult in your life and let them know, hey, I'm feeling this way, I've tried this, and it's not really working, so I'm concerned.
So much like depression, the very first thing that we would do, find somebody trusted who's an adult in your life.
Absolutely.
And so that may be a parent, maybe a guardian, it may be a religious figure in your life, maybe a teacher, maybe a guidance counselor, maybe Mr. Downing, maybe a coach. Again, so often we're in stressful situations in athletics or in academics. Well, that's where your coach or your teacher can really help you out with this. Because if you come to me as a teacher, I can say, all right, now look, here's your grade, here's kind of where we are, here's where you need to be, and we can talk about that, and we can address that issue.
Right.
What your teacher or your coach can't address is larger anxiety issues, but that's still maybe a great place to start, because